house itself was not grand, but it possessed a quiet, resolute charm that mirrored its new owner, Elias. He was a man of straightforward tastes and a singular focus, having spent a decade meticulously navigating the often brutal currents of the commercial real estate market. The move to this specific, tree-lined development wasn't about a status symbol. It was about finally planting roots, a place where the spreadsheets and late-night calls faded into the gentle hum of cicadas. He had purchased a property tucked quietly into the community's edge, a small oasis bordered by a slightly wilder, undeveloped plot of land that gave the backyard a sense of boundless green space. This immediate feeling of peace, however, was predicated on a fundamental misunderstanding: that a line drawn on a surveyor's map actually meant something to the people who believed they owned the spirit of the neighborhood. From the moment his moving truck pulled away, a subtle shift occurred in the air. The community was lovely, yes, but it was also organized, intensely organized. The lawns were uniformly perfect, the mailboxes identical, and the silence often felt less like tranquility and more like careful monitoring. The new resident, content in his private space, barely registered the occasional slow-moving car that would pause just a fraction too long outside his driveway. He saw neighbors as potential friends. They saw him as an unknown variable. The house he had purchased was unique. Due to a historical quirk of the original platting, it sat precisely on the edge of the official Homeowners Association, HOA boundary. He was physically in the neighborhood, but legally, his specific lot fell just outside the covenant's binding reach. This detail, carefully confirmed by his closing attorney, was the quiet anchor of his independence. To the HOA, however, the concept of a non-member occupying a prime piece of real estate within their visual sphere was an intolerable structural flaw. The first sign of the coming storm wasn't a formal letter. It was the way Mrs. Eldridge, who lived 3 doors down and was rumored to know the precise date every single rose bush on the street had been planted, began watching his house from her bay window. It wasn't simple curiosity. It was the glint of proprietorship, the subtle aggression of a warden studying a new inmate. He had moved in seeking peace, but what he had actually entered was a territory ruled by an invisible, iron-fisted committee that viewed conformity not as an ideal, but as an absolute, enforceable law. The watched home and his house, sitting on its sovereign little piece of earth, was already a silent, unwitting challenge. The tension was not yet a clash, but the coil was tightening, ready to spring. The quiet observation quickly transformed into overt hostility. It began with the little things, the passive-aggressive notes tucked under the windshield wiper, never signed, always citing some obscure subsection of a regulation manual Elias didn't even possess. It was the placement of his garbage bins, positioned inches too far from the curb according to an invisible yardstick, or the color of his porch light, deemed non-standard for the community's aesthetic. Elias, a man accustomed to rational negotiations over multi-million-dollar deals, initially treated these nuisances with mild amusement, seeing them as the tiresome background noise of suburban life. He'd simply adjust the bin, change the bulb, and toss the anonymous notes. What he failed to grasp was that this petty harassment wasn't about compliance. It was a test of dominance. The HOA, primarily personified by the self-appointed neighborhood czar, Mrs. Eldridge, was probing for a weak spot, trying to enforce their will purely through exhaustion and intimidation. The situation curdled the day the lawn notice arrived. It was official, stamped with the HOA logo, and delivered by certified mail. The subject was the small, untamed patch of native grasses and wildflowers bordering his property, the very patch that gave his yard its distinctive, wilder edge. The notice demanded immediate removal and replacement with approved, shortcut turf, citing an inconsistency in landscape standards. Elias smiled faintly. He knew better. He had his survey, and that specific strip of land, according to his title deed, was not within the HOA's legal boundaries. The threatening notice. This was the moment the battle lines were drawn. Elias sent a succinct, professional response, including a copy of the deed's plat map, which clearly showed the jurisdictional line carving his property out of the association's purview. His note simply stated, "I am not a member of your homeowners association, and the land in question is private property, outside of your governance." The response from the board was not an acknowledgement of error. but an escalation. They dismissed his evidence as outdated and immediately levied a $500 fine, payable within 10 days, threatening a lien on the property for noncompliance. This was no longer passive-aggressive. It was a direct assault on his property rights. The absurdity of the situation, being fined hundreds of dollars by an organization he didn't belong to, over a patch of grass he legally owned, ignited a slow, steady burn of righteous anger within him. The peace he had sought was being systematically destroyed by bureaucratic pettiness. The fine, the fence, and the full legal war. The fines became a weekly ritual. They found something new every 7 days. The angle of his mailbox, the placement of a seasonal decoration, and eventually, the audacious claim that his driveway was too dark and needed resurfacing with a lighter-colored material. The total fines soared past $1,000, each notice accompanied by increasingly shrill, threatening language about legal action and foreclosure. Elias ignored the payment demands but began meticulously documenting everything. Every notice, every date, every petty complaint was catalogued, forming a thick binder of evidence, the silent chronicle of their power abuse. The tension became deeply personal when the HOA focused on the fence. Elias had planned to install a privacy fence along the back perimeter, not to hide anything, but to provide a secure space for his future dog. The HOA's architectural committee rejected his plans, not because of the design, which matched the neighborhood standard, but because the proposed fence line technically crossed the supposed border they claimed was under their control. When he proceeded with the fence installation, ignoring their illegitimate rejection, the reaction was swift and dramatic. Mrs. Eldridge, flanked by 2 other board members, physically confronted the contractors. The confrontation at the fence line. They stood on the easement, waving copies of the community covenants, shouting about trespassing and property violations, forcing the work to halt. Elias arrived to find his contractors packing up, intimidated by the sheer, unhinged fervor of the HOA leadership. Standing there, facing the smug certainty in Mrs. Eldridge's eyes, he felt a powerful sense of violation. They weren't just imposing rules, they were actively obstructing his ability to use his own land. It was at this moment that Elias moved from defense to strategic offense. He realized that arguing with them using their rulebook was pointless. He needed to use the one rulebook they couldn't ignore: commercial law and property ownership. He stopped responding entirely, letting the fines pile up, letting the threatening letters drop into the recycle bin. His silence, however, wasn't surrender. It was a sign of a deeper, more calculated plan forming. He began spending his nights poring over property tax records, public records, and the original developer filings for the entire subdivision, not just his lot. He wasn't looking for a loophole in the covenant. He was looking for a structural flaw in their entire foundation. The silent strategist, the HOA, was focused on his small patch of lawn, while Elias was quietly analyzing the entire chessboard. The police, the confrontation, and the unseen asset. The crescendo of the dispute arrived on a perfect Saturday morning. Elias was in his garage when he saw the flicker of movement. The HOA board had decided to take direct action against the non-compliant landscaping. A crew, hired by the HOA, had parked their commercial mower on his driveway and were beginning to dismantle the small, natural grass area bordering his property. The trespassing crew. Elias stepped out and stood calmly between the crew and the disputed land. He didn't shout. He simply stated, "This is private property. You need to leave immediately." Mrs. Eldridge, who was supervising with a triumphant air, stepped forward. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the morning stillness. "This is a violation. You are out of compliance, and this is a community standard enforcement action. If you interfere, we will call the police." The final stand. Elias just watched her. The calmness in his posture a sharp contrast to the furious flush on her face. "Go ahead," he said, the words heavy with hidden meaning. "Call them. Tell them you are trespassing on private land." The moment she reached for her phone, a profound, unshakable sense of satisfaction settled over Elias. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the official involvement of law enforcement on his property, at the explicit demand of the HOA. He knew he was about to give them exactly what they asked for, but not in the way they expected. As the police sirens grew louder, their lights strobing over the pristine street, Elias had one final piece of documentation to pull from his carefully organized briefcase. It wasn't the deed to his house. It was a completely different document, involving a complex financial acquisition that had taken place discreetly over the last 6 months, leveraging his expertise in commercial real estate. The officers arrived, and before Mrs. Eldridge could launch into her frantic, self-righteous explanation, Elias stepped forward. "Officer," he said, his voice calm and clear, "I'd be happy to show you exactly why this is a clear case of trespassing and harassment. It relates to the owner of this community's underlying commercial assets." He was about to reveal the single, devastating truth he had uncovered during his silent investigation. A truth that didn't just relate to his lawn, but to the entire financial solvency of the association's common areas and infrastructure. He held the document in his hand, a simple legal statement that would instantly flip the power dynamic from petty squabble to a massive corporate reality check. The HOA had called the police to assert their control over a patch of grass. Elias was about to show the police the legal document proving he controlled not just the grass, but the ground beneath their feet. The confrontation had reached its boiling point. The police were present. The accusers were ready to testify. But the true nature of Elias's power, and the full extent of the HOA's disastrous mistake, was still hidden. What exactly had Elias bought? And how could one man's quiet acquisition of a seemingly unrelated asset be the ultimate, devastating key to silencing the entire HOA for good? The air vibrated with the silent, charged expectation of imminent disaster. Mrs. Eldridge stood with her arms crossed, the 2 patrol officers observing the scene with practiced neutrality, waiting for the first word to drop. The HOA president launched into her prepared speech, her voice a clipped, self-important narration of rules, fines, and the flagrant disregard for community standards represented by Elias's mere existence. She pointed to the disputed strip of grass, then dramatically toward Elias, demanding that the officers issue a trespass warning to him for interfering with the HOA's sanctioned maintenance crew. The officers turned toward Elias, their expressions shifting from detached observers to figures of authority. The moment had arrived. The full weight of the HOA's abuse, their willingness to weaponize law enforcement over a patch of wildflowers they didn't even own, pressed down on him. This was the peak of their arrogance, the final, desperate assertion of their invented power. Elias did not raise his voice. He didn't argue about the fines or the grass. He simply opened his leather briefcase, not to pull out his original deed, but a single, thick document stamped with a corporate seal. He handed it to the senior officer, who took it, his brow furrowed in confusion, expecting perhaps a citation or court order. As the officer unfolded the document, reading the bold header, a complex corporate acquisition title, the color slowly drained from his face. The document's impact, his eyes darted from the paper to Elias, then over to the smug, oblivious Mrs. Eldridge, then back to the paper. "Ma'am," the officer finally said, his voice slow and deliberate, injecting the word with a newfound, heavy formality. "This document. This shows that Mr. Elias is the current owner of Community Assets Holdings LLC. Mrs. Eldridge's victorious smile froze, a grotesque mask of impending terror. The officer continued, his voice gaining volume, effectively announcing the verdict to the entire silent street. Community Assets Holdings LLC, according to these very current public records, owns all common areas within this development. That includes the retention pond, the park, the clubhouse, and all private streets and easements. A stunned silence fell. The hired lawn crew stopped their engine. Neighbors who had been watching from behind parted curtains edged closer to their windows, sensing a seismic shift. The unraveling and the true cost. The revelation hit Mrs. Eldridge and the two silent board members like a physical blow. Their faces cycled through denial, confusion, and finally, a white-hot, sickening realization. The fines, the threats, the police intervention, all had been based on the belief that they controlled the neighborhood's infrastructure. Elias had calmly revealed that he owned the roads they drove on, the ground the clubhouse stood on, and the park their children played in. The backstory was simple, a strategic masterpiece of commercial leverage. While the HOA owned the community's covenants, the rules, they had always leased the physical land of the common areas from a holding company, a shell corporation set up by the original developer years ago. This company was a complicated, forgotten asset. Elias, leveraging his deep expertise in distressed real estate, had spent the last 6 months quietly identifying, negotiating, and purchasing the entire holding company, the one entity that had true, ultimate power over the physical space of the subdivision. The cost was substantial, but the ultimate prize, the absolute total vindicaton, was priceless. Elias had been letting the HOA fine him, harass him, and obstruct his property because he was waiting for them to officially involve the law on the very ground he now controlled. Mrs. Eldridge found her voice, a desperate, thin squeak. "That's impossible. We pay dues. We manage the grounds." Elias finally stepped forward, moving from the defensive position he had held for months to a posture of absolute, unassailable authority. He addressed the officer, completely ignoring the frantic HOA members. "Officer, the people standing here demanded you enforce a trespass warning." "I am happy to comply," Elias said, his eyes finally meeting Mrs. Eldridge's, which were now wide with dawning horror. "However, as the owner of all common area easements, I would like to make it clear that the trespassers are actually the individuals who initiated this call. They are currently standing on private property owned by Community Assets Holdings LLC, disrupting the peace. Their maintenance crew is using my property without permission." He didn't need to say more. He had just flipped the script entirely. The HOA had called the police to remove him. Elias was asking the police to remove them. The power reversal. The officer, now utterly convinced and utterly professional, turned to the stunned board. "Ma'am, based on the documented evidence of ownership presented here, you and your employees are being asked to vacate the easement immediately. Any further attempts to interfere with Mr. Elias's property, or any property within the holdings, will be treated as criminal trespass." The ultimate humiliation. The final moments of the climax were a slow, excruciating unraveling for the antagonists. Mrs. Eldridge, the self-crowned queen of the subdivision, could only sputter, watching her carefully constructed world of power and petty control collapse. The other board members looked at her, their silent expressions a mixture of betrayal and pure, incandescent panic. They hadn't just lost a battle. They had lost the foundation of their entire kingdom. The HOA's hired maintenance crew quickly packed their equipment and drove away, eager to escape the embarrassing legal vortex. The police officers exchanged a final, knowing glance with Elias, a silent acknowledgement of the most dramatic power reversal they had likely ever witnessed in a neighborhood dispute, and departed. Elias was left standing alone, bathed in the quiet, stunned silence of the street. The petty fines, the threatening letters, the public humiliation they had attempted to inflict, all of it had culminated in this single perfect moment of vindication. They had tried to destroy his peace and seize control of his small patch of land. Instead, he had quietly bought their entire operational backbone. He looked over at the disputed strip of earth, the wildflowers now looking defiant and beautiful. The biggest question was no longer about his grass, but about the HOA's immediate future. What happens to an HOA when their most defiant non-member is suddenly the one who holds the keys to their entire community? The departure of the police left a vacuum on the street, a silence far louder than the preceding confrontation. The HOA board members, physically standing on what they now knew to be Elias's land, retreated hastily, their initial bravado replaced by a sickening, profound dread. The shock wasn't just about the grass or the fines. It was the realization that their attempts at petty tyranny had been met by a response of commercial, structural demolition. They had fought a zoning dispute, and Elias had responded with a corporate takeover. The immediate aftermath was chaos confined behind closed doors. The emergency board meeting, held hours later in the very clubhouse Elias now technically owned, was not a strategic session but an internal implosion. The financial reality was stark. The association's operating budget was built entirely upon a lease agreement for the common areas. If that lease was terminated or renegotiated unfavorably, The HOA had no park, no pool, and no private streets. Their very ability to collect dues and justify their existence vanished. They were not just powerless. They were functionally bankrupt without Elias's cooperation. The thousands of dollars they had spent on frivolous legal threats and fines now felt like pocket change compared to the existential debt they suddenly owed him, the debt of their entire community's infrastructure. Mrs. Eldridge, the driving force behind the harassment, was now isolated, her authority crumbling under the weight of her colossal error. The other board members, facing potential personal liability for abusing their power and incurring unnecessary legal fees against the new common area owner, turned on her with the fierce, cowardly speed of rats fleeing a sinking ship. The phone calls, once reserved for issuing threats, were now frantic, desperate appeals aimed at Elias, who let every single one go to voicemail. He had fought a public war. He would dictate the peace on his own terms. The terms of capitulation. 3 days passed in absolute, agonizing silence from Elias. During this time, the entire neighborhood was consumed by speculation, fear, and a dawning, grudging respect for the quiet man they had dismissed as a target. The board finally received its only correspondence. A single, crisp letter delivered by a corporate legal courier, addressed simply to the governing board of directors. The letter, drafted with surgical precision, was not a declaration of war, but a non-negotiable blueprint for surrender. Elias was not seeking financial gain. He was seeking permanent, unassailable peace and a public acknowledgement of the board's misdeeds. The terms were laid out in 3 devastating parts, each designed to strip away the board's arrogance and ensure future accountability. Rectification and resignations. The board was required to hold an emergency community meeting within 7 days. At this meeting, they were to publicly apologize for their pursuit of illegal fines against Elias and officially void every outstanding fine issued against him and any other resident during the previous year. Immediately following this statement, every member of the current board was required to resign their position, effective immediately, citing a profound failure of governance and due diligence. The new lease covenant, Elias, as the new landlord, would offer a new, 5-year lease for the common areas, but under drastically altered terms. The new covenant included a specific clause that clearly defined the boundaries of HOA enforcement versus non-member private property, making it explicitly impossible to fine or harass non-members. Crucially, it instituted an automatic, substantial penalty, payable to the community fund, not Elias, for any fine deemed arbitrary or capricious by an independent arbiter, effectively removing the fun and power from petty rule enforcement. The monument to defiance. Finally, the letter demanded a written, permanent guarantee that the disputed strip of natural grass on Elias's property would never be touched or subject to any landscaping demand by the HOA or its agents. It was to remain exactly as it was, a visible, daily reminder of the board's catastrophic overreach. The board initially debated fighting, hiring their own high-powered legal team, but a simple line at the bottom of Elias's letter silenced them. Failure to agree to all 3 points will result in the immediate issuance of an eviction notice for all common area properties, effective 90 days from today. This includes the termination of the lease on the clubhouse and the closure of all private access roads. The choice was clear. Submit to Elias's terms and retain a neutered, humiliating version of the HOA, or resist and watch their community collapse into a chaotic mess of inaccessible parks and unmaintained, private roads. The threat of their neighborhood descending into foreclosure chaos was too immense. They signed the agreement, the quiet triumph. The community meeting was a tense, unforgettable spectacle. The usual small crowd was replaced by nearly every resident, all drawn by the electrifying rumors of the land transfer and the impending public reckoning. Mrs. Eldridge, stripped of her self-important posture, read the statement of resignation. Her voice, once so sharp and commanding when issuing threats, was now brittle and thin, wavering with humiliation as she admitted the board's egregious errors and their failure to verify the legal status of property ownership. The moment she stepped down, surrendering the gavel, her ultimate symbol of power, the room experienced a cathartic release. The resignation and humiliation the residents, many of whom had suffered their own small injustices, watched as their chief antagonist was publicly stripped of every shred of authority. It was a triumph earned not through shouting, but through cold, calculated legal maneuvering. Elias attended the meeting, but he did not speak. He sat in the back row, a quiet, resolute presence. He didn't gloat or wave the signed agreement. He simply absorbed the silent acknowledgement of his victory. His revenge was perfect because it was not motivated by hatred, but by the desire to restore his peace by ensuring the entire system could never again be weaponized against him or anyone else. The long-term impact on the neighborhood was profound and permanent. A new board was tentatively formed, staffed by neighbors who genuinely cared more about landscaping budgets than power trips. They operated under the oppressive shadow of the new lease agreement, terrified of triggering the arbitrary fine penalty and facing Elias, their silent, powerful landlord. The petty enforcement machine ground to a halt. Elias's house, on the edge of the development, became a symbol. The disputed strip of native grass, now protected by a legal covenant, grew into a wild, flourishing border of defiance, a beautiful, intentional scar on the uniformity of the subdivision. It was a reminder that true ownership and commercial power trumped social hierarchy and petty rules. Elias had achieved more than just winning a fight. He had re-engineered the power structure of the place he called home. He had bought peace, secured by the deed to their streets. He proved that sometimes the only way to beat a petty tyrant is not to argue about the rulebook they wrote, but to quietly buy the entire printing press. They called the police on him for trespassing. He responded by making them his tenants. The question for every homeowner watching is not just how to beat the HOA, but this: when you are pushed to the brink, are you fighting the visible bully, or are you quietly planning to buy the ground they stand on?